Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be previewing the third round series between the San Jose Sharks and the St. Louis Blues, the Western Conference Final matchup. This is actually an encore, you could say, of the 2016 Western Conference Finals between these two teams, in which the Sharks were victorious in just 6 games. So the Sharks will be looking to replicate that performance, while the Blues will be looking for some revenge on a Sharks team that is certainly different, but also has a lot of the same faces on it: Thornton, Couture, Pavelski, Hertl, Jones, Burns, Vlasic, a lot of the same players, even if there are a couple new ones like Carlson, like Meyer, like LeBanc, while the Blues also very familiar faces, but also a few new ones like O'Reilly, like Bozak, like Binnington especially. For the coming into this series, the Sharks and Blues both had to take their their second round series to 7 games. The Sharks defeating the Colorado Avalanche, the Blues defeating the Dallas Stars, 2 wildcard teams that really brought these two stronger divisional teams to the brink, almost eliminating them. The Blues were actually down 3-2 in their series, while the Sharks were up 3-2 after Game 5, and so it was a close call. And the Blues managed to come out on top, so did the Sharks. The Blues have the extra day off. Maybe it will matter somewhat, but it shouldn't matter too much when it comes to the game on Saturday. For the regular season matchups between these two teams, these are actually a lot less meaningful than most, because of the fact that the Blues were a completely different team early on in the season compared to later on. Basically, January was sort of like a barrier between a terrible St. Louis team and a fantastic St. Louis team. And so November 9th, the Sharks were shut out by the Blues 4-0 by Chad Johnson. Of all goaltenders, he's nowhere to be found here for the Blues. And then a week later or so, November 17th, the Sharks had the 4-0 shutout of the St. Louis Blues. So both of those games coming when the Blues were not playing very good hockey. Eventually, they'd find themselves in last place in the league. So the really main game to actually look out in the regular season matchups would be March 9th, when the Blues were playing very well, when the Sharks were also playing rather well, and this was a 3-2 overtime victory for the Sharks. This was a very fun game. The Sharks were the better team in that one. They come out on top in overtime, and if that game is any indication of what could happen in this series, it looks like we're in for yet another good one, and probably another nervous one. So in total, the Sharks managed to outscore the Blues 7-6 during the season series. Not a lot of goal scoring, and I will bring up the fact that the shutout for the Sharks in November 17th was by Aaron Dell, if I'm not mistaken, so not by Martin Jones. For the lineup for the San Jose Sharks, they are completely healthy on paper. Of course, we still know there are things wrong, likely with Pavelski, probably with Donskoy, with Carlson, maybe with Vlasic, and probably a few other players that we just don't know about. But Sharks first line, Meyer, Couture, and Nyquist, probably for the foreseeable future. I could see at some point Pavelski jumping back to that first line if they do stumble, if the Sharks maybe lose a game or two in this series. We'll see what happens. The second line of Kane, Hertl, and Pavelski looked quite strong in their first game together, at least in these playoffs. In Game 7 against the Colorado Avalanche, a couple of goals there. Then the third line of Sorensen, Thornton, and LeBanc, third line that has been together all these playoffs, and they were good in Game 1 against the Avalanche, but they were not really apparent in any of the other games in that series. And then a fourth line of Donskoy, Gaudreau, and Carlson, Donskoy getting that key game-winning goal in Game 7 against the Avalanche. In terms of replacement, Michael Haley is probably the first to draw into the lineup, if I had to guess. Lukáš Radil is there, but he wasn't particularly impressive in some of the games that he played, even when on the second line. But if a couple of other players who are like actual top 9 forwards do get injured, Radil would probably come in before Haley. So for instance, if Pavelski and Donskoy were to again get injured and sit out, Radil would be the player taking his spot in the top 9, not Haley. And then Dylan Gambrell is always a possibility, but he also was not impressive in the game that he got. I think that was back in Game 1 against the Avalanche, so I doubt we see it happen. For the defensive pairings, Vlasic and Burns, who were so good against the Avalanche, they will likely remain together coming in here against the Blues. Dylan and Carlson, even though there were some disagreements between these two players, they shall remain as a defensive pairing. And then Braun and Ryan. Of course, Ryan sort of just there to take up 6-7 minutes in the first couple of periods and then sit out the rest of the game. Sharks continue to likely run with a 5 defensive core unit. Maybe if this series, develops positively and the Sharks are up heavily, Ryan gets a few more minutes because he has been playing decently well. I guess we'll see what happens, but it seems unlikely. As well as Tim Heed, just in case a defenseman for the Sharks does get injured. Vlasic, we saw, was injured a couple games against the Golden Knights, which was not good for the Sharks. So hopefully this defensive unit can stay healthy, because when Tim Heed filled in, well, it was mostly because of the fact that Vlasic was out. It did not go particularly well. And then for the goalies, it is Martin Jones leading the way with Arundel as a potential backup. He did not need to make an appearance in the series against the Avalanche, but of course he did make a couple of appearances in the series against the Golden Knights when Jones was struggling. For the Blues, the first line, Schwartz, Schenn, and Tarasenko. This line was obviously the big marquee line for the Blues last season, but with a lot of the signings, they didn't spend too much of this year together. They were put back together by Craig Berube, I think, for Game 6, if I'm not mistaken. So Schwartz, Schenn, Tarasenko, obviously very, very good. Schwartz has been solid in these playoffs. Tarasenko, always a danger, even if he hasn't necessarily been putting up so many points here in this regular season and these playoffs. Second line of Sammy Blais, Ryan O'Reilly, and David Perron. So O'Reilly and Perron, newcomers to the Blues. Perron, sort of like an old newcomer, I guess you could say, because he was with the Blues for a long time before getting that stint with the Golden Knights. He's had a very good season. Also a pretty solid playoffs, I guess you could say. O'Reilly, very good season for the Blues. Also a solid playoffs. And Sammy Blais, a player who's jumped into the lineup here and played pretty well for a couple of games for the Blues in these playoffs. Third line, Maroon, Bozak, and Rob Thomas. He's, I think, a teenager, if I'm not mistaken, age 19, and he's been pretty good for the Blues in these playoffs. Tyler Bozak has been quite surprisingly strong for the Blues in the playoffs, and Patrick Maroon, the overtime hero, the second overtime hero, actually. The double overtime hero, I guess I should say, in that Game 7 against the Dallas Stars that brought the Blues to this third round matchup. And then a fourth line of Barbashev, Sundqvist, and Steen, a pretty solid defensive fourth line. For potential fill-ins, Robbie Fabry could come in, as well as Zach Sanford. They have played a lot of games. I think Robbie Fabry had about 8 during these playoffs. The Blues, of course, faced off against the Jets in the first round and the Stars in the second round, so they've played a total of 13 games. Fabry playing 8 is over half, so he could potentially jump in. Sammy Blais, I believe, took his spot, at least for the moment. We'll see how the Blues lineup develops. I feel it's a bit more fluid than the Sharks lineup, which there shouldn't be any substitutions unless a player actually does get injured. On defense, the first pairing, Edmondson and Pietrangelo. Pietrangelo started this season off very rough, but he's been so good since about January and into the playoffs. Second pairing of Bouwmeester and Parayko. Bouwmeester also started the season off quite rough, but has been a lot better for the Blues. And then a third pairing of Dunn and Gunnarsson. I think Gunnarsson is injured somewhat. I don't know if he'll be there for Game 1. If he's not, Robert Bertuzzo will probably take his place, as they have 7 capable defensemen of playing, similar to how the Colorado Avalanche had that with Patrick Nemeth as their 7th guy, who they ended up actually going with in the past couple of games, running 11 forwards and 7 defensemen. For the goaltenders, it is Jordan Binnington leading the way, with Jake Allen as the backup. Not very expected at the start of this year, but he has been very good for the Blues. Binnington, solid stats through the games against the series against the Stars and the Jets, and we'll see how he can perform against the Sharks, because for my X factors for the Blues, it would have to be Jordan Binnington. The Sharks matched up against Fleury, who was so good in the playoffs last season, but they managed to abuse him somewhat and get some goals past him. Then matched up against Grubauer in the second round, who was so good against the Calgary Flames in the first round, but the Sharks managed to beat him consistently enough that they managed to take that series. And now Binnington, who has had a couple of rough games in these playoffs, certainly, but he has been mostly strong against a very good Jets team, or a very good offensively Jets team, and a Stars team who maybe is not that great offensively, but a very resilient team. So we'll see how the Sharks are actually able to take advantage of this rookie goaltender, because of course he is still a rookie. He was not expected to even be the starter here for St. Louis. I think he was 4th on the depth chart at the start of this season, so it is a bit of a surprise to see him here. We'll see if the Sharks can abuse that fact, or if Binnington will continue his strong play. For the Sharks, the X factor I have for them would actually be the Sharks' depth, because it was not very apparent in the second round against the Colorado Avalanche. Besides that first game where the Sharks had contributions from their third line, it was basically invisible for the rest of the series. And while Hertl had a couple of big games in games 5 and game 7, and Kane was pretty effective in game 7, and Pavelski, rejuvenated that line in game 7, the second line wasn't that great through the majority of the series. Only the first line was there. And the Avalanche, you could maybe get away with that because past their first line, their depth was not fantastic, although they did play particularly well, Jost and Compher and all of those players. But the Blues have very strong depth, even past Schwartz, Schenn, Tarasenko. O'Reilly is a very good player. Perron has been quite solid. Maroon has looked good. Bozak is good. And so the Sharks will have to win the depth battle against the Blues because they're also quite the deep team. And if the Sharks can win that depth battle, they should be able to win this series. For the offensive contributors so far in these playoffs for either team, Logan Couture leads the way for the Sharks, and I believe in the playoffs in general, with 9 goals, 5 assists for 14 points. Tomas Hertl tied completely with him with 9 goals, 5 assists, and 14 points of his own. Brent Burns also has 14 points, but he has the reverse, 5 goals and 9 assists. Burns, of course, putting up 10 points, I believe, in that series against the Colorado Avalanche, so a huge offensive series for him. Couture and Hertl have at times stepped up huge for the San Jose Sharks, just completely taken over games for themselves. Couture, obviously, that game 3 against the Avalanche. Hertl, that game 5 against the Avalanche, and other times during these playoffs. And then Erik Karlsson there at the back, 0 goals, 12 assists for 12 points of his own. Now, all 4 of those Sharks players actually have more points than any of the Blues players have. The Sharks have played 1 extra game, but that shouldn't be too impactful. Jaden Schwartz leading the way, 8 goals, 3 assists with 11 points. Pietrangelo then is next with 2 goals, 9 assists for 11 points. O'Reilly with 2 goals, 7 assists for 9 points. And then Colton Parayko, 1 goal, 6 assists for 7 points. And if you're wondering where Tarasenko is, I believe he has 5 goals and 0 assists for 5 points, which was somewhat of a surprise, although 5 goals is at least decently solid. For the goaltenders, Martin Jones, 2.72 GAA and a .910 save percentage as it continues to slowly recover from those pretty bad first games 2-4 against the Golden Knights. And then Jordan Binnington, a 2.39 goals against average with a .915 save percentage. As I said, he had a couple of rough games in these playoffs, but he's been mostly solid, and the stats definitely reflect that. And so these teams are looking rather even, while the Sharks have managed to score a few more goals than the Blues have managed to do so. Binnington has been slightly better statistically than Martin Jones, even if Jones has maybe been equal with him in the last few games. You do technically still have to take into account those games 2-4 against the Golden Knights. What could also be important in this series, and what could trump the Sharks' depth in terms of an X factor for the Sharks, would be the special teams, as the Sharks have struggled mightily on the power play in this past series, but so have the Blues. The Blues actually have a lower power play percentage. Of course, the Sharks' power play percentage is skewed somewhat by the fact that they got those 4 goals on that major power play, but still, the Blues power play percentage is somewhat lower, and the Blues penalty kill percentage isn't that great either at 75%. So the Sharks have the advantage statistically, special teams wise, and while the penalty kill was very, very good against the Avalanche, it was the power play that really let them down. They managed to still win that series anyway, thanks in part to that penalty kill being strong, but the Sharks power play will need to be apparent in this series if they want to be able to take down the Blues. So for my prediction, I had guessed the Sharks would beat the Golden Knights in 7 games. I was correct about that. Then I said a bit more bold that the Sharks would beat the Avalanche in 5 games. That ended up being incorrect as it went 7 again. So in this one, I will play it a bit right in the middle. I'll say that the Sharks will defeat the St. Louis Blues in just 6 games. That does, state the fact that I feel the Sharks will win on the road in Game 6 to finish off the series. Maybe a bit of a bold call, but as the Sharks did in the Stanley Cup, in the Western Conference Finals 3 years ago, defeating the Blues in 6 games, I feel like they will have a repeat of that performance and do it again. Class dismissed.